Welcome to Chapter 14, Part 2, The Civil War. Abraham Lincoln will take office in March of 1861. And do we remember what the South said if Mr. Lincoln becomes President of the United States? That is correct. They would secede from the Union. Not only would they secede from the Union, but they downplayed Mr. Lincoln as a mild-mannered, soft-spoken kind of individual. And we're going to see here later that that was not quite the case with Mr. Lincoln. In this map, you'll see by February of 1861, of course, Abe Lincoln has sealed the deal in presidency, but not officially until March. But unofficially, he is the president at this time. You'll see here in the red Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina have all seceded from the Union. In this slide, you're going to see artist renditions of what the attack on Fort Sumter would have looked like. In the upper left-hand corner, you're going to see ironclad ships within close proximity of the fort. Upper right-hand corner, you're going to see artist rendition of the cannons that were used. Again, the reality of things was that these ships were much, much closer. In fact, close enough that they could probably scream from the ship to the fort back and forth in communications. Lower left-hand corner, you're going to see and lower right-hand corner, you're going to see Fort Sumter is up in flames. Well, what is one thing that is necessary to fight a war during this time? Actually, there are several things. But what's one key explosive thing that we would need on hand? That would be gunpowder. We're talking several kegs, several hundreds of pounds of black powder sitting in wooden barrels waiting to be used. And if you knew where those were stored, you could pretty much seal the deal and take care of things in a battle. In this slide, you'll see today's version of what Fort Sumter looks like. You can see it's quite a ways out into the bay. Middle picture there, you're going to see people that are just basically tourists who are walking around getting the, I guess, full experience of a tourist from their point of view. Upper right-hand corner, you're going to see some of the cannons that were used during the war that were retrieved from the water. And the pictures on the bottom, again, will show you just kind of the depth of this fort and what it was like. You can see that there are several places where men could fire from, but they're going to be hunkered down in, and so they're not going to be at the tippy top of the fort shooting at people because they'll be shot at. Fort Sumter. This was named after General Thomas Sumter, who won many battles against the British in the Carolinas during the Revolutionary War. It's located in the harbor of South Carolina. And this really all started, remember that South Carolina is claimed it's seceded from the United States of America and eventually will form the Confederate States of America. And in doing so, they claim that everything on their territory in South Carolina belongs to the Confederacy. However, the Union thinks otherwise. The Union thinks that this is a federal garrison or a federal fort, and that it should be under control of Union forces. And so this is not really a strategic point of contention, really. It's more of a matter of pride. The Union says it's ours. The Confederate says, no, it's not ours. It's what Confederate says it is ours because it's on our property in the South. So Lincoln is going to send some food and general provisions that are necessary to sustain life, basically, to this garrison at Fort Sumter. He's not going to send troops. He's not going to send guns or ammunition, stuff like that. Just basic life essential things. And the Confederates are going to try to cut off this shipment because if this shipment continues, then the fort will continue on, and the Confederates want to put a squash to that. So Confederates hope for a peaceful Fort Sumter evacuation, but it's becoming ever so not evident. The Confederate Secretary of War telegraphed General Beauregard of the South Confederate Army on April 10th with instructions to demand the evacuation of Fort Sumter as soon as he was certain that President Lincoln's resupply order was genuine. So they knew that the supply was coming, and General Beauregard told the people in the fort, "You need to leave, it's time to go." If the demands were refused, the general was to reduce the fort down to smithereens. Major Robert Anderson of the Union forces would march his men out. They could take their arms, their private property, and be supplied with transportation to any U.S. Army post that he chose, if, and only if, he was to surrender peacefully. This is what he would get. Well, Unions were just as stubborn as the Confederates, and he refused. Confederates knew that it would be a matter of time before they starved to death, and he'd be forced to evacuate anyhow. If Anderson specifies a time when he would evacuate, the Confederates promised not to bomb them. This is almost a gentleman's way of fighting a war. We're trying to take the peaceful approach to this, trying to give them options, let them leave in peace without shooting anybody, because that's not what either side wanted, especially the Confederates. They didn't want this. Well, this message reached General Anderson after midnight. Major Anderson, excuse me. The major took his time formulating a reply, and in the early hours of April 12th, he presented him with this answer. He calculated that he would evacuate at noon, Monday, April 15th, unless he was resupplied by that time. That proved unacceptable, for the Confederates wanted to prevent the arrival of supplies and end the crisis immediately. The Confederate officers left the fort at 3:20 a.m., warning Major Anderson that the bombardment and inevitably the Civil War would begin within 1 hour. On April 12, 1861, at approximately 4 a.m., Confederate Roger A. Pryor was given the honor of firing the first shot, which would inevitably start the American Civil War. Some 6,000 Confederate troops encircled the harbor that morning. Several dozen cannons and mortars bore on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter boasted more than 4 dozen usable guns, but the garrison could only man a few of them at a time. So, who's got the advantage here? The North in the fort, or the South out in the water? Well, it might be a draw, but the fact that Confederates had more time to prepare for this, and they had more ammunition and more men surrounding this fort, it was inevitable. And again, in this photo, you can if you can kind of envision the troops in the fort, where they would be, there would be some underground tunnels that they could stay for protection, but you're constantly being bombarded by 30 and 40-pound cannonballs that when they explode shrapnel or pieces of metal over the place. And you could take little pot shots with some rifles and maybe knock out a few people here and there on the ships, but remember the range and the accuracy of a black powder rifle is not that accurate as some people suspect it might be. And you could fire some cannons, but if you're going to fire cannons, it puts you at the top of the fort. And putting you at the top of the fort puts you in harm's way of directly getting shot. In this link here, some really kind of neat tour that you can take of Fort Sumter and the surrounding areas. And again, Fort Sumter was no strategic importance. It was more of a, it's mine, no, it's mine, no, it's mine. Okay, before we go to the huge overreach of power, we're going to talk a little bit about the evacuation ceremony and the Confederate victory. Major Anderson planned to fire a 100-gun salute to the flag, A small steamer waited for them at the wharf on the afternoon of April 14th, while Anderson's soldiers gathered. Cartridges lay piled around the guns, and at 2 p.m. the salute began. Each crew had fired numerous rounds when a stray spark prematurely ignited one charge. The accidental explosion killed several troops nearby, and Major Anderson ordered the salute cut short at 50 rounds. Anderson reported the outcome of the battle to Secretary of War of the North of New York, and he says this: having defended Fort Sumter for 34 hours until the quarters were entirely burned, the main gates were destroyed by fire, the gorge walls seriously injured, the magazine surrounded by flames, and its doors closed from the effects of heat, 4 barrels and 3 cartridges of powder only being available, and no provisions remaining but pork, I accepted the terms of evacuation ordered by General Beauregard, being the same offered by him on the 11th instant, prior to the commencement of hostilities, and marched out of the fort Sunday afternoon, the 14th instant, with colors flying and drums beating, bringing away company and private property, and saluting my flag with 50 guns. So after almost 2 days of constant bombardment by the South, Anderson knows that he didn't have a chance. And he accepted the terms of General Beauregard and said, okay, we'll leave. We take our stuff with us, don't harm us, and we're allowed to go pretty much anywhere we want and not be taken prisoner of war. Well, this was a huge blow to the Union Army and a huge win for the Confederate Army. Now let's talk about the overreach of power. Mr. Abraham Lincoln. He acted without the authorization or approval of Congress, mostly because they weren't in session when all this occurred. Number one, after Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for 75,000 people to put out the fires of the South. So asking for 75,000 volunteers to take up arms for this cause. Number two, he authorized the spending for a war that he declared, not Congress. The current U.S. debt was $65 million, and by the end of the war, it would be $2.6 billion with a B. That's $44 billion in today's money. Imagine all that money being spent on this war and what it could have been spent on. And number three, suspend the privilege of writ of habeas corpus, which generally means that you're not going to bring your person to trial. You're just going to take care of business as it is. And because Congress is not in session, the president acted on his own authority as the person to declare war. Whereas if Congress was in session, they would discuss it. They might even bring the Confederate Army generals there and have a discussion about what they want and how we can peacefully resolve this. That didn't happen. And you also see that the Legal Tender Act of 1862 allowed the government to print paper money known as greenbacks, which was minted officially by the United States Mint and not by the numerous minting companies that were in different towns printing their own money, and that they could sell $500 million in bonds to raise money. Again, this is the North. This is not the South doing this. Lincoln proves that he won't back down. Even after this defeat of Fort Sumter, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas secede from the Union. A Confederate capital is now established in Richmond, Virginia, and the people of Western Virginia, loyal to the Union, separate in 1863. The National Bank Act of 1863 allowed for the creation of a nationwide banking system that loaned money to the government to pay for the war, and also a national system of paper money and coins. Again, you will find U.S. coins from back even in the 1700s, but they're not specifically directly from the government. It is several different people making their own money for their own region, essentially. Income taxes, the thing we dread when we look at our paychecks. In 1862, again, this is the North, The first income tax was established in the Union by President Lincoln. A 3% tax was imposed on individuals earning between $6,000 and $10,000, $600 and $10,000 a year. 5% for those who exceeded $10,000. Now, if you're making $10,000 a year back then, you are making some very, very good money. It means you're probably the business owner, wealthy owner of a factory or something like that. In response, in 1863, the Confederacy also established its first graduated income tax, which exempted wages, which means you don't have to pay taxes on the first $1,000. But anything after $1,500, you would then be taxed. And as the cost of war continued to rise, the Union increased the income tax rates to bridge the budget deficit. So it now becomes 5% tax rate between 600 and 5,000, and 7.5% tax rate on incomes ranging from $5,001 to $10,000. Anything above $10,000 was at 10%. So within a year and a half, if you're a wealthy business owner and you made over $10,000, you were paying 5% income tax, but now you're paying 10%, so you're paying double the amount of taxes. Keeping the border states of the Union would be a military and political goal for Lincoln. But why? Well, if we lose these to the Confederate, it increases their population by almost 50% and would weaken the North's position for continue this war. In our last slide, extra, read all about it. Lincoln denies emancipation of slaves. Is that correct? Yes, it was. He did deny emancipation of slaves at first. What I want you to do is I want you to visit this website. And your assignment is, what was Lincoln's initial plan for freeing the slaves? And 2, did it pass? Why or why not? And that concludes part 2, chapter 14.